Oshio Nagaga, everybody. Hey, welcome to the Fractured Faith Podcast. It's your host, Joshua Hopping. And today, we got a little bit of a crazy episode to talk about here, but we're really going to be talking about, is Christianity inherently colonial in nature? Is Christianity inherently colonial in nature? There's a question that came up a couple of months ago, actually, when I was having a chat and we were talking about how Christianity was kind of anti-empire or kind of against the power structures. And it really was talking about American Christian nationalism. And somebody said, hey, look, actually, Christianity is colonial in its inherently nature. It is what it is. You cannot separate the two of them. And that got me thinking about the question. So I want to kind of take a look at this one. Now, this is going to be a two-part series. So next episode, we're going to actually look at Christian nationalism, especially within the United States of America, current situation, as well as historically, because nationalism, Christian nationalism specifically, has been around for a while. It's not a new phenomenon. Even though it's kind of reared its head up more recently in the last couple of decades. But this time, though, we're really going to kind of look at Christianity and kind of the colonial nature of Christianity, if at all. Again, that's the question we're going to be able to answer. Now, if you're new to the podcast, let me introduce myself real quickly. Again, name is Joshua Hopping. I am a former pastor and church planner. I have my master's of theology and culture from St. Stephen's University, and I am author of 3 books, 2 within theology, spirituality, and 1 in business. So I kind of consider myself a lay theologian. I am also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and I try to approach things from an indigenous, specifically a Cherokee worldview whenever I possibly can. And so that's kind of the range that I'm coming to and talking to you guys about. Now, with that kind of introduction out there, I really want to kind of, again, let's kind of peel this thing down and break down this ideal of, or the question, is Christianity inherently colonial in nature? Now, the first thing we got to do is define some terms, right? Because terms are important. I go back to Plato, right? We ask questions, we define terms, but got to get the terms down in agreement, because sometimes we'll use the same word, in this case, an English word, and we will mean different things. So Christianity, what is Christianity? Well, if you go back to the second episode of Fractured Faith, they're actually me, and at the time, my co-host Angel was actually on there, and we talked about what is Christianity and who is a Christian. Well, in there, one of the things is we talk about, in a broad sense, Christianity is a religion centered on Jesus of Nazareth, who became known as the Christ. And the ideal Christian came out in Antioch. Actually, there was a bunch of followers of Jesus who were following the way, as a way of life. And these non-Christian folks called them Christians, which is Christians as little Christ, or basically followers of Christ, the Messiah, or Jesus in a sense. So in other words, we're people who are following Jesus in that broad sense. So the Christian, or Christianity, really is a religion or a way of following Jesus of Nazareth over the last 2,000 years. Now, there is an argument that can be made that there's a difference between Christianity as a religion and following Jesus of Nazareth. And a lot of scholars have made that distinction. A lot of lay people have made that distinction. I've made that distinction myself, because Christianity sometimes gets really big into the structure of what churches and the hierarchy and the theology and the focuses, and a lot more kind of involved in the religion of Christianity, that more than what even Jesus said when he said, hey, come and follow me. It was a little bit of a different structure within that sense. But for this question and for this episode, when we talk about Christianity, it really is this bigger picture of whatever group or spirituality you want to use to that still follows Jesus as that centerpiece. Now, I will actually expand it even a little bit more, because Christianity, you got to think about it, it's deeply connected to the Hebrew faith, because Christianity claims to be, or Jesus claimed to be, the fulfillment of what started among the Mosaic Hebrew kind of religion and their spirituality, which is, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and then King David and the prophets Isaiah and Amos and all that. So there is that continuation in that area. And so I think we really need to look, especially we talk about is Christianity inherently, if we look at the inherent or something that's built into that system, we kind of need to go back and actually say, hey, was there something built into that Hebrew mindset that then bled over into when Jesus kind of picked it up and started talking about it? And then when Paul and so forth went forward, was there something in there that it was inherently colonial in that nature that we want to push from? So it really is. I know I'm kind of doing a broad definition because I think it is important as we kind of contemplate this question that we don't try to narrow it to focus, because sometimes we actually leave it. Because I will say, and we'll get to in a minute, is there are definitely branches of Christianity and branches of theology which are, I would say, inherently colonial in a lot of ways. But I think Christianity is defined in the broad sense, in more of the sociological sense of saying, hey, this is a spiritual faith or view that centers on Jesus, then that's where we're kind of be able to go from, right? And it's kind of a continuation of what started in Genesis through the Old Testament and New Testament. Now, the second term that we want to define is colonial. What do we mean by colonial, right? If we're going to say something's inherently colonial, what does that mean? Well, okay, colonial really, when people talk about colonial architectural or colonialism, really they're referring to European colonialism, 1500s to 1900s, largely British. I know the Spanish did a lot of stuff in a lot of areas, but speaking in English-speaking countries in the United States, really referring to the British rule, the British colonies, this ideal that the European kind of powers came over and colonialized and took over things. And of course, the American rule took that one step further, because after they rebelled against Great Britain in the Revolutionary War, the United States kind of really ran with this kind of worldview, the colonial worldview, and they had their own colonies. In fact, the United States still has colonies in Puerto Rico and American Samoa and in Guam and various other places. We actually have the United States kind of empire still exist in so many ways and areas. And so, but when I'm talking about colonial, especially we're talking about this sense of inheritance, I'm really going to broaden this out a little bit, because throughout history, people groups have spread across the land. Some groups have stayed put, some have just traveled through it, some went from war for famine, some were refugees, some were whatever else, right? But there was different parts of this ideal of colonial powers that came in. Alexander the Great was a very much colonial before colonial Europe, right? He left out of Macedonia, kind of the East, and he spread Greek culture throughout the entire Middle East. He conquered over Persia, he conquered Egypt. He made Greek the language of the official language of the entire area. He brought in Greek gods and Greek goddesses. And so he's very colonial in that nature. Before that, you actually even had the Babylonians were doing a lot of that same stuff in so many ways, right? So there's been these different colonial ideals. So for me, when I'm talking about this ideal of colonialism, I'm really kind of using it as a sense of concept of when one group comes in and takes over another group, right? And so, in other words, I'm going to come in and I am now in your rule, and I'm going to force you to do what I want to do and do my religion and my faith and my culture, not yours. So in that sense, kind of this question of, is Christianity inherently colonial? You can almost get to the question of re-asking it or expanding it to say, does the faith of the Bible inherently take over and forces out other indigenous spiritualities? Okay, does the faith of the Bible inherently take over and force out other indigenous spiritualities? And again, as a Cherokee Nation, gentleman here who had the family, is definitely a very valid question to ask and say, well, what's going on? So my answer really is no, yes, maybe, which is kind of odd. I know I'm going to have my bets a little bit, but let's kind of get into the nuances of it, because there's no elements, there's yes elements, and then there's the maybe elements at this as well, right? If long-term listeners know, I like the mystery. I like the tension. The real world is very, it's not easy. It's not simple. Things are complex. Things are kind of a little bit interesting. So we're going to dive in on this one as we kind of look at it. So the first response, no. The faith of the Bible is not inherently colonial in its nature of forcing takeover. Now, underlying this ideal of that no is a sense that at the very, very root of the faith is the ideal that you have this one God who created everything in the world. Okay, this is Genesis 1. There's actually two creation stories in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They're slightly different, but both of them says that you have an uncreated God, a creator who's unmade. He just kind of shows up from somewhere we don't know. And there was matter in the world, the primordial kind of oceans and depth. And out of that was everything else that was made, the lights, the sun, the moon, the earth, the animals, the waters, all that stuff kind of came out of that ideal of the creator God creating something. Now, under that worldview, you can actually say that all other religious systems and all other religions or spiritualities are deviations from this primary system. So you have this one monotheistic faith that God creates everything. Follow me. I made humanity. I made everything. And in Genesis, you see God saying, hey, go and follow me. You have Enoch and you have Melchizedek and you have Noah, so forth. And every time you deviate from that, any other thing else is a deviation from that. So in that sense, then if you call people from these other deviations back to the faith of the Bible, you're not colonializing them. You're not forcing a takeover. You're actually calling them back to the truer faith of what they started with. Now, that in of itself is a major freaking claim. I mean, that's a big deal. Like I know people right now, if you're listening, go like, whoa, wait a minute, wait. Christianity is a fairly new religion, first in 2000. The Hebrew or Judaism is older than that, as we know. But even outside of Judaism, we know that Zoroastrianism came even before Judaism. We know that there's Buddhism and Hinduism and other different tribal faiths that were around long before the Moses kind of write things down to what we know as the Old Testament. So yeah, those are historical realities. I fully admit that actually is that way, and we definitely even see within the Hebrew scriptures that things kind of shifting a little bit too. So that is valid. So that's where we say no. Well, maybe Christianity, maybe the faith of the Bible is a little bit inherently colonial, right? If the no really doesn't kind of stand up to historical kind of evidence, then maybe it is. And so if you look at the Bible, then okay, well, there is this belief that there are other gods and goddesses out there. There's Baal, there's Asher, there's demons and spirits and the things out there, and we know that the people are not supposed to go follow these, right? It even says like, hey, don't go worship Baal in the Old Testament. Don't offer your sons and daughters as sacrifices to these other deities. In the New Testament, Jesus says, hey, go out into all the world and tell everybody about me, right? To pronounce the kingdom of God is coming and everything else. So there is a sense that the faith of Jesus, the faith of God, the Bible, is supposed to be spread and to go out, and you're to stop doing what you're currently doing and not to worship these other gods and goddesses and deities and actually change and worship Jesus. So in that sense, you kind of like, well, yeah, I can see that. It's colonial in that sense of stop, worshiping idols and follow me. Right. Or stop being an atheist and follow me. And so there is a changing of that. Now, whether that's persuasion of an ideal, in other words, I'm just persuading you to come versus being too colonial. Colonial almost has a inherently kind of this ideal that, again, an empire or something, another group is forcing you to change to that view. where if you're just presenting a better option, that I wouldn't actually say is colonial. It's just you present facts and present information and you persuade somebody to change their viewpoint because cultures change, life changes, things happen. And that's different than having a power structure like the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great or the Roman Empire or the United States or Great Britain forcing you to do something, which again is definitely, like I said earlier, is more colonial in the sense that it's forcing that out there. So again, no, yes, and that comes back to the maybes because, well, within the scriptures, you see people of different faith living together. We definitely see how Melchizedek, which was Abraham, he was the king of Solomon of what became known as Jerusalem. It was not there was a city of peace beforehand, and Adam pays tithes to him because he was a priest of God. So here you see that God is actually dealing with somebody who's not of Abraham. He's actually just a contemporary of Abraham that God is dealing with. You see other religions throughout the Old Testament pop up from time to time, sometimes in a very negative, sometimes in a very positive manner. Amos 9:7 is definitely a very powerful verse, and there's other like it, but in Amos 9:7 it says, "Are not you Israelites the same to me as the Cushites? Did I not bring Israel from Egypt and the Philistines from Kapor or the Armenians from Kir?" So there's this idea that God is still very much active in the nations around Israel just as much as he is in Israel. In fact, if you read the prophets, pretty much the major or the minor prophets, a lot of them they're actually judging these other nations for what they're doing, which is mind blowing because it's like me looking and saying, "Hey, I think Mexico, you're doing things wrong, right? I think Spain, you're doing something wrong, and I think God's telling me wrong." And it's like, well, why? You're not from Mexico. You're not in Mexico. You're not in Spain. You're those are countries around the world. Like, how dare you preach or prophesy against me? But it's almost a sense that God actually is caring about these other countries and these other people groups in the area there around Israel even at the time. So really kind of trying to remind Israel, I would say, is that, hey, you're not really that all that. Yeah, I'm working with you. Yeah, the Bible is written from an Israeli kind of Hebrew viewpoint, but that doesn't mean that God stopped working with everybody else. And I think from an indigenous point of view, we actually, several of our elders, I'm thinking right now, Stephen Charlton, I think, is really a big one. He talks about how we have our own Old Testament within Native American kind of cultures and stories. So we have stories of how God, the Creator, actually worked in us before the missionaries and before the invasion of the Europeans come about. We actually knew the Creator and we actually were connected, and we have our own stories that kind of help out with that. And so you see that kind of same process there within the Old Testament as well. Really kind of means again that there's stuff that's a little bit more complex than just a yes, no, maybe kind of answer. There really is a lot more complex when we talking about this because we know that God, even from the scriptures we have, was working in other nations. We know historically that the faith kind of grew out of different elements, and so what we now know is Judaism or Christianity was influenced by other areas, right? So even though I think there's an echo or a truth there, and I would say there's a true line that goes throughout everything, and I think it really is revealed in the scriptures what that is, but we have to recognize that it is complex. They really are not simple answers. It's not a simple question, it's not a simple answer at the same time. So, what are we to do? How are we to approach this and how we to look at this? Well, I think one of the good ways of actually looking and approaching this is we really need to kind of start looking and seeing. That picked up. I set my coffee cup down for those, and it kind of echoed throughout my sound here. But we really, I think, when we start looking at Christianity, again, I just want to be really clear is that we definitely there's some problems, especially the American, Western, European view of Christianity has some major problems. It has been colonial. There are theologies that have actually grown up around the empire of the European forces, right? Starting in the Roman Empire in the fourth century, it shifts and becomes takes Christianity as an official religion. It wasn't Constantine; it was actually one of his like grandsons or whatever down the line. But he kind of starts it, makes Christianity a favorable religion. They had a couple other emperors that try to take it back, and then eventually, I think it was like 360 or so, 68, that it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And at that point, everything really starts being ruled. And you have just war theory out of Augusta of Hippo in more of the 5th century that really kind of starts saying that, hey, the Roman Empire can actually go and fight on behalf of God. This is like, oh, we're going to go do this. And then you have again the feudalism and nationality, and you have the British and the Germans and the Spanish and the Portuguese, and the atrocities that really came about of that, even to the point that in the United States, we had the Constitution, and the United States Constitution says that we guarantee the freedom of religion. However, it was illegal. They actually passed a law in I think 1800s, and they made it illegal for Native Americans to practice their spirituality up until it was in 1978 with the passing of the American Indian Freedom Religion Act that can actually be able to let us be able to practice our religion. So that I was, truth be told, I'm 45. I was born in the 80 model, so 2 years before I was born is whenever we were legally allowed to do our own spirituality, which is just mind-blowing, right? But that's the reality happening. So before then, we had a lot of the churches, and Christianity was actually forcing down, the United States government was forcing us not to do things. We couldn't do our dances. We couldn't do our ceremonies. We were unable to even have powwows for a long time, for a while. Or if we did powwows, it was the adults and the kids couldn't do it. And there was a lot of this oppression of the empire, the American empire, the United States empire pushed down upon our indigenous people and tried to cast us out and tried to force us to become something that we're not. And that's a reality. So there is a sense that when people talk about colonialism, Christianity is like, we got to realize that as well. It was definitely hijacked and abused in that name. And I say hijacked because when I look at Christianity, when I look at it, and as I find it focused around the person of Christ, of Jesus of Nazareth, I look at Jesus and I say, okay, I'm a follower of Jesus. And John 14:9, Jesus tells actually Philip, goes, whoever's seen me has seen the Father. Paul in Colossians 1:15 says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So it is this ideal that the invisible God, the creator of heaven and earth, came in the incarnation, actually entered into humanity and became human. This wasn't in the appearance of a humanity. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't a spirit. This was him becoming creation. Philippians 2, he emptied himself to become human in every way and humbled himself even to death on a cross. That is huge. This is why I love Athanasius of the Church Fathers, or Maximus, or John of Damascus, the people really talking about the incarnation and how insanely crazy it was that the creator of heaven and earth actually came down and dwelt in among his people to show us the way forward. Even this point that I would say the blood of the cross is worthless if you don't have the blood of the womb. It was the blood of Mary's womb, the birth, the baptism of Jesus, and the blood of Mary's, womb that actually allowed us to even have the cross, because without being incarnate and actually coming into this one, the cross is meaningless. It had to be God himself coming in and living among us. So when we're looking at this ideal of Christianity and we look through the lenses of Jesus, not looking for the lenses of Paul, not looking through the lenses of even Moses or Abraham, but looking through the lenses of Jesus. And I think when you start looking into that, you start seeing, hey, where's his mercy, self-sacrifice, his call of love, the call of justice, this call of being there. Now, this is not to say that all religions, of course, are equal, because they're not. I too much respect for other groups in spirituality. Even Cherokee spirituality looks nothing like what we see in Jesus, per se, especially seen through the Gospels. However, there are elements and echoes that you see throughout it. We have stories of a unmade creator God who made the heavens and earth, and we have stories of us supposed to be lived in balance or tohi and harmony with each other and respect each other. That we have stories about being able to live in that. Well, this is the same thing that Jesus came. He says, "Hey, I'm coming in here to bring, this life together, to call this out, to bring back what this needs to be, and against all the abuses and all the atrocities and all the stuff he had under the Roman Empire of his day." So I think there's echoes and there's similarities again, because I do think that God was in work in all religions and all focus and all people all time. And so I think when we start looking for the unmade creator and we start looking for the incarnation, we start looking for echoes of Jesus, we will start seeing that. And when we start seeing that, we hang on to that and we realize that we need to decolonialize this European American Christianity that is actually really toxic and harmful for so many people that are there. I mean, to the point of where, and this is, again, I heard earlier, I was a former pastor, church planner, and I have been overseas and talking. I've seen abuses and I've seen good things. I've seen phenomenal people and I've seen some very painful things. And one of the painful things is where you run up to people and you won't even feed anybody. You won't take care of them. You won't give them food. They're starving homeless people and you won't even give them food until they sit through a sermon. Why? Because their soul is more important than their body is the mentality, which is a very empire colonial view in my head. It's just insanity that you can separate this spiritual whoa kind of thing from the reality that a person is hungry and you can justify not feeding them because you have to preach to them. And I'm like, of course, everybody's going to say, they're all going to come down and get an altar call because they're hungry. Anyway, that's kind of a different story, but a little my passion there. But so when we talk about, or when I talk about actually decolonizing Christianity, again, this ideal of this Christianity viewing of following Jesus, is I'm not like talking about like throwing away all doctrine and scriptures and everything else. And what I'm trying to do is look and learn from our indigenous or African or Asian or Latin American voices. I mean, there's a lot of other voices within Christianity who follow Jesus that are not coupled with the empire. The Western European mindset is coupled with it. I know a lot of people who look to the German theologians of up a lot of these different ones. I can't remember the top of them right now because I don't really like them, quite frankly. But they're like, oh, you got to learn German if you're going to be a theologian because the Germans are big in there. And I'm like, what? The German theologians? I mean, you got Luther and such, but even Luther was like, hey, let's kill the poor people because he supported the king, and he was very anti-Semitic in some ways, and so he did some really good stuff, but he also did some bad things. And then a lot of the German theologians in the 19th century, 1900s it is, in the 20th century, 1900s, they led to two different world wars. So why should I be looking at the theologians of Germany when that impacted those wars? It's just like I think we need to listen to our African American or our African or our Asians and our Latin American voices and looking at it. Now, not to say that there were not people, there were Germans that actually, like Bonhoeffer and such, who actually pointed back and fought against a lot of the nationalized kind of colonial churches of his day. And I think we can learn things from him. I'm not saying that, but I think there are a lot of times that we really need to listen to these other voices and be able to remember that Christianity was not a white man's religion. This was born in brown skin, Arab, Middle East of Israel. It actually went into Egypt, and most of our good church fathers was actually in Egypt or in Tertullian was in, I guess with Libya today. So North Africa was all into there with a lot of our different places, as well as some of our kind of the Syrian and kind of up in the Turkey area with our theologians. So it's really good on that sense. But when we're talking about decolonizing Christianity, we're really talking about detangling it from the European culture and untangling it from this ideal of the empire and the building of the ideals. really kind of pulling that back and saying, you know what if the gospel is not Western in that way? I really love the church fathers. Irenaeus of Leon talked about recapitulations, that Christ summing up all humanity in himself. He's not replacing him, but he's healing and fulfilling all the cultures and really bringing them thing in there. Which is just a great, posture of indwelling transfiguration. And but I think those church fathers and those church mothers, for example, really can help us really untangle ourselves from this dominance over the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, of we have to have dominance over the seven mountains of media and politics and education and stuff. Again, that very colonial. We have to take everything back and say, no, 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 no. Jesus actually humbled himself and became like this human in culture to work in and through us. He didn't come with a sword. He came with the wounds of the servant. He came the servant and underneath, and shifting it from control to communion, from authority to participation, from certainty to mystery, from law to love, from cultural uniformity to diversity. If you look at the end of Revelation 21, you have all these voices of these tribes and these people before the throne room of God. It's not a monotheistic kind of, or a monocultural view of sitting there praising God. Is you have all these languages and all these places and all these dresses, all these being right there, and all these colors all mixed up into this kind of this rainbow of diversity. And I think that's a good thing, because the fullness of who God is and creator is seen in diversity, because no one culture, no one group has it all. We all have pieces and echoes of who God is and Jesus is. And so we really need to bring that back and say, yeah, we need to see that and understand. So decolonializing it is really bringing it back to its roots of really allowing for that to come. So that's definitely a really powerful thing to come into it, realizing, also come back to the Trinity, right? You get the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they work in unity with each other, not in trying to take over from each other in so many ways. You actually have all that together, which goes back to listening to voices. I guess, like myself, as an Indigenous lay theologian, you have other Indigenous writers and people. Great one by friend Chris Abatabi and Danny Zacharias, called Reading the Bible on Turtle Island, which is a great hermeneutics from looking at how do you read the Bible in this land from a Native American and First Nation viewpoint. There is the First Nation versions of the Bible. Stephen Charleston for Vision Quest of Jesus, which is a phenomenal book in so many different ways. You get the Black and womenist theologians, Asians and Latin Americans, and even the LGBT plus kind of Christians and people coming in and Christian, feminist writers that are great. Sarah Bessie, I love her book. Was it Jesus Feminist? I think it is. It's another good one in so many ways. So there's a lot of these really good sources we can look at and be able to pull in. There's actually a night commentary called The New Testament in Color, which is this really great one. Esau McCulloch actually kind of helped bring that together. But it's all these theologians of brown and black and different gender kind of people doing commentaries on the New Testament. And it's just a phenomenal read, because you get to see different people brought out in so many ways, which is great in pulling back in. Good quote. How you're talking about Julia, mystic Julia of Norfolk, talks about how divine love sees the boundary of systems, right? That Christ is a mother pulling out and birthing to us, which is a great way of looking into that one and looking a little bit deeper so many ways. So yeah, it's like really looking and pulling that in. So when we're talking about that and we talk about Christianity being inherently colonial, I go back to my yes, no, maybe kind of response, in the sense that it can be used as that sense, but I do not think it's inherent. And I go back to, I really do not think Christianity is inherently colonial in the sense that it's there to have power over, to force people to do something. I think Christianity has been co-opted, especially by the empire in the West in so many ways. I even will say Jesus' command to his followers to go into all the world and proclaim the kingdom of God and proclaim his deals. I think that is supposed to be done as a persuasive matter of being able to talk and show them forth, hey, this is who I am. Maybe, you can actually have a discussion about that. I don't see that as colonial in that sense, because again, colonial is this is for power over structure, taking over. I think the persuasion of that, and I think enough indigenous people throughout history has also recognized the echoes of Christianity within their own faith, knowing that God was working in there already. And actually would say that that's why the faith of God and echoes of God predates even Judaism, predates who Moses is, because I think there's echoes of them coming into even Zoroastrianism or other different religions, because I look at Jesus. And if I see echoes of Jesus in these other groups, then I will pay attention to that, because I do think that there is something uniquely different about the incarnation of Jesus in Nazareth that has set the tone and that has actually set us. And we need to look at that. And anything that claims to be Christianity that does not look like Jesus is abomination. I will say that again. Anytime you have a Christianity that does not look like Jesus, it is an abomination and it is not true Christianity, even though you have that title they've thrown onto it. So, yeah, there's a lot to be unpacked there. That's my view on answering that question. Next episode, I'm really going to talk a little bit about Christian nationalism. Again, it's not going to be another tough one because there's definitely abuses of that, but I think we need to talk a little bit about Christian nationalism, especially in our current political situation in the United States. So until then, I appreciate you guys for listening. Give it a like, give it a follow, share the podcast with somebody. Again, we're on YouTube, we're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I really do appreciate you guys. If you have any questions or comments, drop a comment in the notes below, and I'd love to hear from you. So until then, take care. Dona daga ai. Until we see you again. Bye.